Hello, what's going on in the multipolar world? So, there's been a lot actually that's been going on since I last spoke with you. We have the Estonians saying that Russian MiGs crossed over into their airspace. It looks like they didn't, that they flew in international airspace, but they were close, flying from one part of Russia over to Kaliningrad, which is Russian territory that happens to be right next to Baltic states. But that happened. And then we also had some drones that somehow ended up deep in Poland, actually further than the Russian drones are actually capable of flying. But Poland said that that was an incursion in their airspace. Looks like a false flag operation or a mistake, but they used the opportunity to call a meeting of NATO and warmonger a little bit against Russia. So we had that going on. We had CNN urging um, Ursula von der Leyen to shoot down Russian airplanes, of course, leading to World War III. That would be a disaster. But openly encouraging her, asking why they haven't done it yet. Um, so that was something else that happened. We have President Trump saying that Europeans should shoot down Russian airplanes. Um, so that's something else as well. Um, we have Mark Rutte, head Secretary General of NATO, talking about shooting down Russian planes, kind of walking back some of Trump's statements, but also saying basically that they might do that. They could happen. Um, so that's going on, and then let's see what else we. Just a number of provocations and discussions about war, about possibly shooting down Russian planes. Of course, would lead to World War III, probably. In my estimation, I mean Russia would be forced to do something if one of their planes, let's say it was flying to Kaliningrad, and let's say the Poles shot it down. I think they would be forced to do something. Maybe they wouldn't immediately fire off a nuclear missile, but they would probably target some sort of maybe a factory in Poland or Germany that was building missiles for the Ukraine. That they might could do would do that. Then NATO would feel like they were forced to respond. Of course, many of them would gleefully do so. Um, and then, so I could easily see how this could escalate into World War III if that happened. Um, so hopefully it doesn't happen. Hopefully, wiser voices prevail and we do not end up all getting nuked. But today I actually want to talk about why I feel like peace is not likely at all in the near future in the Ukraine. Um, and there's a number of reasons why I think so. Now, remember when Donald Trump came into office, he said that he would have peace in a day. And then I think it was 30 days. And I believe it was 100 days. And the latest I've heard is that it would be sometime before the end of the year. Um, I don't think it's going to happen anytime soon. And here's some of the reasons why I think it's not going to happen. First of all, the core demands of Russia make peace unlikely. So their core demands are no NATO. Um, Now, NATO, Mark Rutte, Ursula von der Leyen, and other ones, they're still saying that the Ukraine is a sovereign country. They can choose to join NATO if they want to. And that's a problem because if they do make moves to join NATO, um, that that would be a disaster. Russia would feel like they would have to do something. So, the Europeans are still saying that they have a right to join NATO, and as long as that's on the table, then Russia's going to feel like they have to do something. And Russia can't really back down from this demand either, because they can't be surrounded by NATO countries. They already have now Finland on their border. That's a Russian country. They have the Baltic states, and they don't feel like they can be surrounded by NATO countries. So it's a problem. Neither side really can back down on this because the NATO countries can't say, well, now suddenly, we don't view the Ukraine as a sovereign country. We don't think that they can choose to join NATO, especially when they've been saying for years, for a decade now, that they can join NATO. So that's a problem. And that's a core demand, like I say, that neither side can back down on. Another core demand that neither side can back down on is to acknowledge the annexation of the four provinces, so plus Crimea. So Russia has said that this is a demand that has to be met, that the Ukraine has to acknowledge that those annexations. And they're saying not just that the Ukraine acknowledges the annexation of the territory that the that Russia holds, but also the original borders of the four oblasts plus Crimea. So some of that territory is still in Ukrainian hands, and they cannot hand over that territory without a fight, at least in the present system. Um, and expect for Zelensky to stay in power. In fact, I think it's likely that if he were to hand over, if were to acknowledge the annexation of the four oblasts plus Crimea, and were to withdraw from the portions of those four oblasts that the Ukraine still holds, that he probably would be assassinated. That's just my guess. But I don't think that the neo-Nazi militias that have so much influence in the western part of Ukraine would tolerate this. They've threatened him before with assassination, and I think that would be a bridge too far. They would assassinate him. He would have to flee the country, I imagine. And who knows what the next leader in the Ukraine would do. So that's one that Ukraine really can't back down on, at least in the present form, and that Russia is not willing to back down on. They've put it in their constitution. They've talked about it for several years now, how these are Russian territories, and they are ethnically Russian. They're historically Russian territories. So both sides really cannot agree on this. So I don't think it's just possible that they can reach a conclusion, at least right now, on this issue. Now, in the long run, if Russia takes all of these territories, then I could see the Ukraine admitting, like, look, we don't control these territories, but to admit that it's a legal annexation, to say, okay, Russia now owns these by right. I don't know if that'll ever happen, to be honest, unless you have a dramatic change of government in Kiev that would be willing to do that. So there's another core demand of Russia that makes it very unlikely that that we'll have peace anytime in the near future. Another core demand of Russia is denazification. And this is a demand that the West has never really taken seriously. They say, Zelensky's Jewish. He's not even ethnically Ukrainian. He's Jewish. And so, how can you have a Nazi regime that's run by a Jew? And I mean, it on the face of it, it sounds absurd. If you listen to the Western talking points about this, you have to say, well, okay, that makes a lot of sense. How could you have a Nazi regime run by a Jew? It seems absurd. However, the Nazi militias in the Ukraine have tremendous power, and some of their best fighting forces are openly neo-Nazi. They use Nazi insignias. They have the Nazi ideology. they descend from actual real Nazis. It's There's really no denying that. CNN has ran articles in the past before the war talking about the Nazi problem in the Ukraine. Um, so it's really undeniable if you look into the history of the Ukraine that there is a Nazi problem, even right now in the Ukraine. That said, what is Zelensky supposed to do? Is he supposed to take away his best fighters? Is he supposed to say, hey, we do have to root these people out. We do have to do something about this Nazi ideology. We do have to do something about these Nazi units. Now they've renamed some of these units. They've changed up the insignias, but all you gotta do is do a quick search online, and you'll see these soldiers with Nazi flags and Nazi insignias doing Nazi salutes and so forth. It's it's undeniable what's going on. Um, but like I say again, what is Zelensky supposed to do? He's in a war. These are his best troops, and they will kill him probably if he makes a move against them. They only tolerate him because he's very pro-war and he hates Russia with a passion. They only tolerate him because of his policies. It aligns with their policies, at least on these foreign issues, and on also on his domestic um, moves against the Russian language and Russian culture and so forth. So that is really their overriding, um, number one reason to exist. Apparently, is to completely eliminate all Russian influence in the Ukraine, which is bizarre because the Ukraine, especially Kiev, is the mother place. It's where the Russian people, the Ukrainian people, and the Belarusian people, that's where they all come from, is Kiev originally. They view it as their home city, their mother city. And so it's kind of bizarre that they're wanting to completely eliminate all Russian influence, especially when like half the country speaks Russian, and you have these deep, deep ties to Russian history and the origin of the Russian people. But given history, given World War II, and now this war, you can kind of see where they're coming from. But but anyhow, this is not going to happen. Denazification, at least under the present government there in Kiev. I don't think that it's even this possible. I think that Zelensky would be killed if he tried to do this. So, and the West has never taken this serious anyhow, like I say. And again, and Russia can't really back down on this either. They can't, they've talked about this as one of the main reasons for the war from the beginning. They say, look, the Nazis invaded us in the 1940s, and we lost tens of millions of people to this awful ideology, and we can't have a Nazi regime right on our border. You can understand where they're coming from too on this. So this is another reason why, one of the core reasons of the Russian demands, and a reason why I don't think that you can have peace in the Ukraine anytime soon. So another core demand of Russia's is to shrink the Ukrainian military to the point where it would not pose an offensive threat to Russia, where they wouldn't be able to go in and attack the Donbass or Russian cities on the border. And at least right now, that's not going to happen either. The Ukraine is in war. They're trying to build up their military. They're not able to do it because so many Ukrainian men have fled the country, and so many more have been killed by the Russians in the war. Contrary to what Western propaganda says, they're losing more men than the Russians are, dramatically. And we know this from the body exchanges that have taken place recently, where Russia handed over 1,000 Ukrainian bodies, fallen soldiers. The last time this happened, Ukraine handed over 24 Russian bodies, and it's not just an isolated case. The time before that, it was very similar numbers, overwhelming. The number of soldiers, dead soldiers that Russia's handing over to the Ukraine compared to the number of dead Russians that the Ukraine's handing over to Russia. So that's another core demand, shrinking Ukraine's military that the Ukraine cannot meet, really, at least not right now. Uh, and Europe is unwilling to even talk about this. Excuse me. They are focusing on trying to build up the Ukrainian military. Mark Rutte talks about this all the time. Ursula von der Leyen, she talks about this. They all talk about this. They want to strengthen the Ukrainian military, not weaken it. So I don't see that as happening anytime soon. So those are the core Russian demands that are just not going to be met, and that's what. Those are reasons why we're not going to have peace anytime soon. Now let's talk about the core Western demands as a reason for there not being peace anytime soon. One is calling for a ceasefire. They've been doing this ever since the Ukraine started steadily losing territory. When the Ukraine was on the offensive, when they were doing well, there was no talk about a ceasefire. It was just, hey, we're gonna take all of your territory, all our territory back, every square inch we're gonna take, and so there was no talk then about a ceasefire. But now there is, and since Trump off put that on the table, there's been a lot of talk about a ceasefire, and the Ukrainians still say that this, especially Zelensky, he talks about it a lot, and he says, this needs to happen. We need to have a ceasefire. Russia cannot agree to that because they're advancing slowly but steadily. They're advancing, so they're not going to say, hey, we'll stop fighting for a month so you can beef up your troops. You can give your soldiers a break. You can beef up your defenses. You can bring in more artillery, more weapons. You can bring in more Western missiles. While we give you the chance to do this, it's just not going to happen. That would be very, very foolish from the Russian perspective to do that. They're not going to do it. But the West continues to harp on that. Now, Trump no longer does. He no longer talks about a ceasefire. After the meeting in Alaska with Putin, he stopped talking about that. I think Putin had just explained to him, look, this is not going to happen. We can't afford it for this to happen. It would be foolish on our part for this to happen. Putin's position is that there'll be a ceasefire after certain conditions are met, after the Ukraine acknowledges the annexation of those 4 provinces and starts withdrawing their soldiers from the front lines. Then they're willing to have a ceasefire. But anyhow, that's a core demand from the West that's just not going to be met. Another core Western demand is for Russian withdrawal of occupied territories. Now, you don't hear about this from Trump very often, but you do hear about it from Mark Rutte and other people. They say, hey, Russia has to withdraw from all the territory that they've occupied, which is 20% of the Ukraine, before we can have peace, before the West will stop supplying the Ukraine with weapons and so forth, and before they'll stop firing missiles into Russia and these things. But Russia is not going to give up territory that they've lost tens of thousands of soldiers to gain. They've already said they're not going to give it up. They've annexed it in their constitution. They've put it in there saying, look, this is our territory now. So they're not going to give that up. And that's a core Western demand. That's just not going to happen. It's very easy to see why both sides are stubborn on this, why the Ukraine wants it. They want their territory back. I think they have to be realistic about this, though. They're never going to get most of this territory back. Maybe a little bit here and there they could swap for something or another, but it's unlikely that they'll get significant amount of their territory back. Another core Western demand that, again, you don't hear Trump talking about, but you do hear Europeans talking about, is for Russia to pay reparations. Now, the latest scheme by Europeans is to take some of the seized money, frozen assets that Russia had, billions and billions of dollars in European banks. They've stolen that money, but they haven't outright begun to use it yet. Most of it. They've been doing little things here and there with some of it, but they their newest scheme is to use that as to get loans with, to give the money to the Ukraine so that they can buy more U.S. weapons and beef up their military, keep the war going longer. And then they say that the Ukraine will only pay these loans back once Russia has paid reparations for the invasion of the Ukraine, which is never going to happen. Russia's never going to pay reparations for invading them. They're winning the war. They occupy 20% of the Ukraine. The only way this would ever happen would be if they were losing the war and maybe you had a regime change in Moscow. And it's very unrealistic. This is probably the most unrealistic demand out there on either side. But the West is insisting on this, especially Europeans. They're really adamant about their claim that Russia is going to pay reparations. Just not going to happen. And then the last core demand that I wanted to talk about from the West is that um, the Ukraine joins NATO. So the core demand from Russia is that the Ukraine will never join NATO. They want them to put it in their constitution that they're a neutral state, kind of like Austria was during the Cold War, or Switzerland is today, although they've moved away from that a little bit, but historically they are neutral. So this is a core demand from the West, that especially that the Ukraine has the right to join NATO. Remember, they used to push that the Georgia had the right to join NATO, and then there was a war over that, especially once Georgia invaded those two pro-Russian enclaves on Russia's border, and Russia quickly stepped in and put a stop to that. And it could have led to World War III. Thankfully, it didn't. But um, that was a core demand of NATO then. The West is now making this as one of their core demands again, that the Ukraine has a right, at least in theory, to join NATO, even if they're not going to do it now, which Trump has says they're not going to do it now. They say, well, they at least in theory have this right. And Russia says, no, you don't. They don't have the right to do that. If we want peace, then there can be no NATO country, especially with a strong military and an anti-Russian ideology on their border. And you can understand their perspective, but you can also understand the West's perspective on this. You can understand, well, if the Ukraine really is a sovereign country, then they do have the right to join NATO. You can kind of see where they're coming from. The problem is that you have to consider great powers. Great powers, John Mearsheimer has talked about this a lot. They operate by different rules. The U.S. would not tolerate an anti-Russian or an anti-American country right on its border that's being beefed up by the Russians. They would not tolerate this. Remember when the USSR tried to do this during the Cuban Missile Crisis? The U.S. was willing to go to World War III to prevent that from happening. And Russia's willing to go to World War III to prevent it from happening in the Ukraine. So, anyhow, that's another core demand and another major reason why we're not going to have peace anytime soon. So where are the two sides the closest? Let's look at that for a moment. Trump and Russia both agree that there's not going to be a ceasefire. Now, they came to that agreement out in Alaska. They made that they have an understanding there. Now, the Europeans do not have an understanding on that point. They continue to insist that there must be a ceasefire, but at least Trump and Russia agree on this, so they are close there. Crimea, Russia and Trump both agree that this territory will remain part of Russia. It's been Russian for hundreds of years. They've had a major naval base for a very, very long time. The people there are overwhelmingly Russian or pro-Russian. If you had if let's say the UN went there and had a free and fair election with outside poll observers and everything, the people would still vote overwhelmingly to join NATO, or excuse me, to join Russia, not NATO. There would be, it would not even be close, right? Are there some people there who would love to remain part of the Ukraine? Yes, there's some, but there are a small minority. So, um, so this is Trump realizes this. He realizes that Russia is never going to give that Crimea up. They might be willing to swap some other territory, but they're never going to give Crimea up. And so he realized that. So they're close on that point. Now, the Europeans oppose this. They say that every square inch of the former Ukraine has to go back to the Ukraine. So, again, Trump is much closer to the Russians on this than the Europeans are. Trump and Russia also are close on the need for elections. He's talked about this a little bit with Zelensky, about how Zelensky needs to hold elections. He's no longer the rightful president of the Ukraine. His term has ended. He's just stayed in office. And he just declared martial law and says, well, in our Constitution, as long as you have martial law and you're at war, you can't have elections. But they've had local elections. He just won't allow them to have a national election for presidency because he knows he would lose, or at least it would be close. It would open up. It would open up the possibility of him um, no longer being in power. And then what would he do? Flee to Israel or Florida? Probably one of those two. But anyhow, so that's another area where Trump and Russia are close. They agree that there's a need for elections. There's no push by the Europeans for this, though. They don't say that there's a need for elections. They talk about democracy all the time as one of their core values, but apparently they're fine with a dictator in the Ukraine as long as he's their dictator. And so there's that to consider. Another area in which there's the Trump and Russia are close is NATO. Trump acknowledges that Ukraine's not going to join NATO, not anytime soon, at least. That's a core demand of Russia. That's the main reason the war is being fought. The main reason is because the West was trying to bring um, the Ukraine into NATO. They were very open about it. They said that that's the future of it. They talk about it all the time. Um, and so Trump realizes this is the main reason there's a war. It's not going to happen. Russia is not going to permit it. And so he's close to Russia on that point. The Europeans again insist that uh, that that they're that Ukraine has the right to join NATO. And so where are the sides furthest apart? So we talked about this some, but shrinking the Ukraine's military, they're far apart on this. Very unlikely that that's going to happen. Even if we had, let's say that the Ukraine withdrew from some of the territory that they now control in the Donbass and those four, let's say they withdrew from the entirety of those four regions that Russia has annexed. I still don't think that they would draw down their military. Not while Zelensky's in office. You would probably have to have a change in regime there in Kiev. So they're far apart on that. It's probably the least important demand, though. I think that if they met Russia's other demands, that Russia could live with a Ukrainian military about the same size as they have now, as long as they weren't beefing it up and more and preparing for an invasion of Russia. I think Russia could live with that. Like I say, it's probably as long as there's no NATO, as long as the Donbass fortress is annexed, those fortress cities, that Russia and the forest and all that there that Russia's had a hard time going through. They've been very slow clearing this. As long as those are annexed, there's no NATO. Russia could probably live with the Ukraine not dramatically lowering the strength of their military. Um, Another area where the two sides are far apart is international recognition of the annexed territories. We've talked about this. I don't think it's possible. It's very, very unlikely for the Ukraine to do this. Zelensky would probably get killed. Russia can't give up on it either. They've insisted on it. They put it in their constitution. And the Europeans are in a tricky spot on this because so there's a number of European countries that have issues with their borders and territories and that are in dispute and seceded territories and so forth. So if you look um, at Bosnia, for example, the U.S. talks about Europeans and the U.S. talk about how borders are sacred and you can't change borders with war, but they bombed the heck out of Yugoslavia. They bombed Serbia relentlessly, um, and created a fake country there called Bosnia Herzegovina that combines Croats, Bosniaks, and Serbs, and they won't let the Serbs in the Serb Republic of Bosnia secede and rejoin Serbia, even though they're right next door. They have a border with Serbia, and they want to be part of Serbia because they are ethnic Serbians. It's almost entirely ethnic Serbs. So there's a number of issues like that where if Europe said, okay, we're going to recognize the annexation of these borders, and borders are no longer sacred to us, then it would open up a whole can of worms for Europe, especially in Bosnia, but also in other places. So like Macedonia, it could possibly open up a can of worms in Spain, because you've got kind of secessionist regions there. In Italy, you have secessionist regions. Yeah, I don't see Europeans ever going along with this. Now they might de facto put up with the annexation of these territories, especially if Russia continues to advance. But I don't think that they would acknowledge it, not anytime soon. Another complication is that Trump is unique. So nearly the entire foreign affairs community in the United States is hawkishly anti-Russian and for the expansion of NATO. We've talked about this before. John Mearsheimer's talked about it a lot, but Trump is basically alone. It's him and his vice president, maybe one or two other people, and that's it. Everybody else, all the pressure on him in Washington, D.C. is from the other side. People like Lindsey Graham, who really just every day are pushing for war, pushing for expansion of NATO, pushing to bomb somebody somewhere. People like that dominate in Washington, D.C. You also have the revolving door between the military industrial complex and the media and the foreign affairs community. It's an incestuous relationship there. And so Trump is alienated in that respect. He's alone. Um, and that revolving door, that military industrial complex with the media and all, they're motivated to create and expand conflicts. They have money and jobs and prestige at stake, and so they have a strong incentive to alienate Trump. Also, another complication is that these European leaders are very, very unpopular. These ones you see on TV, the leaders in Germany, Merz, very unpopular. The latest poll I saw, he has a 29% approval rating. And he's the most popular of all of these major European leaders, but 29% approval rating. His party is no longer the biggest party in Germany in the popularity polls. Um, the right-wing populist AfD, Alternative for Deutschland Party, who their main issue is immigration and stopping immigration. They want peace with Russia. They're now the most popular party in Germany, and the government there may ban them. There's no free speech. There's no right to form a political party in Germany. They can ban parties whenever they want. Germany is not a free country. in any manner. But at any rate, the popular opinion is against MERS, and he's deeply unpopular. Also, another one of who's very unpopular is Macron, and he's hated basically in France. Hated basically in France. A very very unpopular man. Let's say his. Let's take a quick look at my notes here. His recent popularity was at 17% in France, and he had to appoint his seventh prime minister, I believe, since 2017. His seventh prime minister. France is very unstable. Like I say, Macron is hated by the French public. Um, and so, yeah, and that's a complication. And then you get to the least popular man in Europe, and that is Keir Starmer in the UK. So his popularity is anywhere, there's different polls on this, anywhere from 16 to 21%. This man is despised by almost everybody in the UK outside of the establishment there in London. And now his party, they swept the power in the last elections because the Conservatives had just made a mess of things. The Labour Party swept into office. They had a big majority. Keir Starmer had all of this wind at his back and has just made a mess of everything, really, in foreign affairs, domestic, immigration, housing, you name it. And so he's deeply, deeply unpopular. And every time there's an open seat, just about his party loses another seat. Now there's probably not going to be a general election for a good while, but this is a major complication. So that's another reason, another complication to this whole peace process is the unpopularity of these European leaders. So, well, that's about it for today. I want to draw this to a close before it gets too ridiculously long. But these are my reasons why I think that there's not going to be peace in the Ukraine anytime soon. We've gone through the reasons. We've looked at where the two sides are closest and furthest apart. But the general conclusion is that there's just not going to be peace. Not anytime soon. The war's going to continue tragically. A lot more people are going to die. Um, more territory is going in the Ukraine is going to fall. It's going to be taken over by Russia. Russia's going to slowly advance. Once they get past these fortress cities and so forth in the Donbass, they'll probably advance more quickly. But at the same time, NATO is dead set on supplying the Ukraine with long range missiles that are capable of hitting Russian refineries and factories. And so who knows how this thing is going to play out in the long run. Um, John Mearsheimer says we're going to have a frozen conflict, but how do we even get to that point? How do we get to a point where the killing stops? That's the question I have. I don't see a path even to a frozen conflict in the near future. But that's all for today. I'll be back with you soon to talk more about what's going on in the multipolar world.